Hello, my name's Jane Langston from LearnAnatomy, and today I want to explain a few things to you about the classification of joints. Often people forget what they're called, what the classifications are, and I just want to remind you of a few household items which you have in your own home that you can line up whilst you're revising these things. Well, first of all, what's a joint? A joint is where your body has a bone joins to a bone, and that bone could move a bit, move a little, or move a lot. And the classification of bones is usually based on either structural, so what it's made of, or what it's made from, or functional, as in what it does. Does it move? Does it not move? Does it only move a little bit? So, three types of structural classification. There's fibrous, that means the bone ends are stuck together like glue with collagen fibres, very fibrous joints. And to help me remember that, I've got some really good strong glue. So that helps me remember that these bones don't move when it's a fibrous joint. Fairly fixed, and you'll find those in the sutures of the skull and also in the pelvis where the pelvic bones join together when they begin to fuse together. The second type of structural joint is the cartilaginous joint. Now, the cartilaginous joint is like a lump of fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage that allows a little more movement between bones. So imagine this is a big wad of cartilage. So my two bones, top and bottom, there's a little bit of movement in between. Not a lot, but a bit. Very good for shock absorbency. So we would find a cartilaginous joint between vertebrae. Intervertebral disc is made of cartilage, and that absorbs shock and allows a little bit of give as we twist. So we can see on Boris here that he's got his discs between his vertebrae. There's also some cartilage between the manubrium and the sternum. And of course the pubic symphysis. So it's a big wad of cartilage that allows for shock absorbency and a tiniest bit of movement. So that's the cartilaginous joint. Now, the third type of joint in the structural classification is the synovial joint, and those tend to be quite freely moving within reason because of the shapes. So I like to think of my synovial joints, WD-40 and duct tape. So WD-40, fantastic at making things glide and slide, stop squeaks, it says, loosens rusted parts and frees sticky mechanisms. Well, that's what your synovial fluid does for you. It's secreted by your synovial membranes, which lines your synovial joints, and it's held in place by strapping around the joint, forming a joint capsule. So your body encapsulates the joint with your duct tape, your human duct tape, and often there are ligaments spanning the joint as well, making sure that the joint only moves within its set parameters. So your duct tape not only acts as a joint capsule, but you may have other layers of ligamentous duct tape, and they are your pattern setters. They govern the amount of movement in a joint. So, to help you remember, have your WD-40 and your duct tape nearby. Now, there are 6 types of synovial joint, and they're classified according to really what they look like. So I will start first off on pivot joint, and the pivot joint is the joint that is between C1 and C2. If you remember, C1 sits like a little ring and C2 has a little thing called a dens, which is a small spike that comes out from it. The ring goes round it and that allows our head to turn. So up here on Boris it's at C1 and C2. There's a really good example of a pivot joint. But to help me remember, I've got my kitchen roll. My kitchen roll itself is my C1 with its ring, and my C2 is my kitchen roll holder. So I've got my C1 sitting on my C2 and it acts as a pivot. So I have that lined up to help me revise. The next one in our synovial joints is the ball and socket joint, and that tends to be the one that most people remember. So our shoulders are ball and socket joint, so are our femoral heads that sit in the acetabulum here and rotate round, giving a really good range of movement to our hips and our shoulders. But just in case you can't remember it, get yourself a roll-on deodorant, because the ball and socket inside will help remind you of the ball and socket joint, the synovial joint called the ball and socket. And this is great because it even has a little labrum around the ball to stop it coming out of its socket. Great. Now the third type of synovial joint I want to talk about is the one that I personally forget, and I have to scratch my head each time and think, I know there's 6, which one is this? And it's the condyloid joint, and they are found between your metacarpals and your phalanges. These joints here, these are ellipsoid or condyloid joints, and they're similar in some respects to a ball and socket, but instead of the socket being round and the ball that goes in is round, they're slightly oval shape. So to help me remember that, I've got a hammer, and my hammer has a sort of oval surface to it. So if I cup my hand so I have an oval surface in here, you can see there's almost like a hinge, almost like a ball and socket, a bit of a combination. It gives small amounts of side-to-side movement, but also acts like a hinge. So that will help me remember my condyloid joint, my hammer. Now I just alluded there to the other one, number 4 in our list, which is hinge joint. And hinge joints are nice and easy to remember. We all know what a hinge is. So look at your revision book. We do recommend this one. Look at your revision book and see how it hinges. Okay, and then look at your elbow. Hinge joint here, also a hinge joint at the knee. So good old Boris has got hinge joint at elbows and knees. Now the 5th synovial joint is the saddle joint, and there's only one really good example of the saddle joint, and that's between the trapezium and the first metacarpal, so here. And what the saddle joint is, you imagine the shape of a saddle and the shape of a person's legs. So they sit on top like almost like two Ys or two Vs on top of each other. So there's a slight side to side and a slight rock action, and that gives us the action of our thumbs. The final synovial joint I want to talk about is the gliding joint, sometimes called a planar joint, and what these are simply bones which glide on top of one another. The limits to which they glide are dictated by ligaments or by other bones in line, and you'll find these gliding joints in the tarsals of the feet, say the cuboid and the bones around that, the navicular and so on. So bones glide, but they don't open up perhaps like a hinge. They simply glide, held in place by the human duct tape of ligaments, so they don't glide too far. So to summarise, there are three types of joints in the structural classification. If you remember, they are fibrous, cartilaginous and synovial. And the synovial joints can be broken down into 6 types: pivot joint, ball and socket, ellipsoid or condyloid joint, hinge joints, saddle joints and gliding joints or planar joints. Now the functional way of classifying is much simpler, and that is it either moves, so it's therefore an immovable joint, it moves a little bit, so it's a slightly movable joint, or it moves a lot and it's a freely movable joint. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and hopefully you'll line up a few household items to help you with your revision, because the more links you can have with your everyday life really do embed that anatomy learning.